Hello, everyone. Want to express our appreciation for all of you attending the webinar today and those of you that are listening to the recording afterwards. My name is Craig Binning. I'm the Vice President of LAI, and my host or my main chapter is Simcoe or Toronto. And so I'm pleased to just provide a quick introduction to and welcome to the seminar, the webinar. As many of you are aware, LAI is an international association of land economists, and we have experts from a wide range of fields, and they tend to be the top people in the industry or within their practice areas. And so it's really, we have chapters 27 across North America, also a chapter in London, England, 2 chapters in Spain, and also in India. So it's a real wide collection of experts from across a wide range of areas and disciplines. And as you'll learn, all of the speakers today are LAI members, and they will show you the level of expertise that we have. And it's a great opportunity to connect with like individuals and experts across the globe. I'd also want to stress that this is a really excellent example of LAI International at work, providing these webinars that really have grown in importance through the pandemic, one of the positive outputs of the pandemic, and our Global Affairs Committee, which is really interacting and providing these kinds of opportunities. With that, I'd also stress, in addition to LAI, there's the Land Economics Foundation, which provides an excellent opportunity for providing grants and supporting research into the important areas of land economics. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jim Westbach, who's actually, I believe, 30 years a member of LAI, and he'll overview the webinar and get us rolling. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, Craig. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jim Westbach. I'm a member of the Golden Gate chapter in San Francisco. And as Craig mentioned, I've been a member for over 30 years. And just a wonderful organization with an amazing amount of talent. So pleased that you're all part of it. Today, we're going to talk about the connection between water and land economics. And the series around water and land economics is an outgrowth of the Global Initiatives Committee. And that committee was created to span and bring together perspectives on issues of general concern or broad concern for our members, and to foster cross-chapter sharing of information. Water and land use is a topic that is deep and wide, literally speaking. There are so many different dimensions of this that can be explored, all of which are very critical to real estate and land economics. And the topics range from policy, allocations of scarce resources, infrastructure investment, that kind of thing. And this is particularly critical in areas that have not enough water, and we surely see that in the West where we are here, but also deals with conservation, environmental sustainability, climate change, migration, sea level rise, public health, population growth, a whole number of things that are really critically influenced by the relationship between water availability and suitability and the use of land. So today we're going to have 3 experts making presentations. First of all, we're going to have an overview of what the water land use nexus is about. And then a talk on the watershed management principles. And then lastly, a discussion of invasive and non-native species problems and solutions. And with that, I'm going to toss it over to Holly, my co-chair on this committee. Take it away, Holly.
Thank you, Jim. It's an honor to serve as your co-chair on our committee. And first off, I'm going to start with the logistics for this webinar. Note that we do not have the Q&A open, but we have the chat open. So please put your questions in the chat. We are reserving time at the end for a vibrant Q&A. So please put the questions there. The intention of this webinar is to be introductory in nature to the water and land economics. So it can serve as a platform for future webinars that will dive into some of the specific issues that Jim referred to in his introduction. And as we've already said, it is an honor to introduce our esteemed panelists who are all LAI members. The first speaker will be Jay Lund. He will give an overview of the history of land and water economics. Jay is a distinguished professor from the University of California, Davis, and where he is a distinguished professor of civil and environmental engineering and geography. He also serves as vice director of the Center for Watershed Sciences. I love saying this. Jay is recently retired and he just returned from his adventures out on the sea with sailing. So we love knowing that he's enjoying a full life. And he is recently nomination approved in the LAI Sacramento chapter. Then we'll go to Steve Schwa. Steve is semi-retired, but don't believe that. He works really hard these days. And he will present on integrated watershed management. And it was fun because when I first returned to Sarasota, and Steve is from the Sarasota area, everyone told me, you've got to meet Steve Schwa, Steve Schwa, Steve Schwa. And I'm like, okay, who is this Steve Schwa? I finally met him last November, and I'm like, oh my, he lives up to his reputation. Steve is absolutely amazing. He has 40 years in watershed management and water expertise here in the Sarasota area, and his experience ranges from government to private industry and not-for-profit work. And he is a former Sarasota stormwater director. He's also a former Sarasota planting and growth management executive director. And when you see the first page of his slide, you'll be like, wow, look at that experience. And what I love, when we have Jay comes from the engineering, from an academia standpoint, Steve is our boots on the ground. He is the one that's out there actually devising and implementing water management plans. So we're excited to have Steve. Oh, and one of the other things that he's doing is he is working on a project, a report on the implications of the manipulation of Lake Okeechobee and when certain actions happen, how the nutrients flow to both of the Florida coasts and the havoc that it wreaks from an environmental and an economic standpoint. And he's also working on a project on rehydrating the Everglades. And then we will close out with my friend, Brad Bass. Brad is from the Simcoe chapter, and that is Toronto. And Brad has served around 30 years with the federal Canadian government. And though he's in a new position now, for about 20 years, Brad was in charge of assessing the economic impact of the water quality of the Great Lakes. And from Brad, I learned it's not just about nitrogen like it is down here in Florida. Phosphates are big up in the Canada region. And also, Brad is a senior, he is a status professor with the University of Toronto. And he's just finishing up, they're in the summary stages, a research project with students on the history of land economics. And I am encouraging him to get a keynotes post on the outcomes of that research. And then I'm very excited about this. He is starting a course in the fall that will hopefully be continuous on green infrastructure. Brad is a well-known green infrastructure expert. So those are our panelists, and we're excited for our inaugural introductory webinar. And with that, I'm turning the phone over to Jay Lund.
All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Great. So this is the introduction to land and water economics. I think what excites me most about the subject in general is when things interact, and certainly land and water always interact. You would always rather have almost always rather have waterfront property than non-waterfront property, except during a hurricane, perhaps. Generally, water access, water availability increases the value of land in a real estate sense, and its enjoyment that people have for it. there are occasions, such as with floods, when water access decreases the value of land and increases the risks of being there. In terms of water supply, in terms of water availability, we're interested in more than just presence and absence. We're also interested in the reliability of that water availability, the quality of that water, and the cost of accessing it. There are many different types of water use that help increase the value of land. There's sort of direct uses such as irrigation, drinking water, and the like, industrial water use, commercial water use. Ancillary kind of water uses where you don't actually use much water, but you really value it being there, such as firefighting. If you have a water distribution system, its purposes are not only to supply water for your household, they're also provide water to keep fire from engulfing your household, and as well as having some other values. There is a proximity value to water also. So even if you don't have water right at your property, there is a value to your property of having water nearby. So particularly for recreation, for aesthetics, for views, things like that. And then of course we have floods, which I mentioned before, where you have potential for damages and danger from the hopefully only occasional over availability of water. All of these things interact with time. There's a long history of these interactions, going back to ancient times where people located their villages and their cities and their irrigations, their agricultural systems, so as to be proximate to water, for water supply, for navigation, for avoidance of floods, things like that. In terms of economics, there's even some very early Roman analyses, benefit cost analyses of developing wetlands into agricultural systems, and some other sort of rudimentary benefit cost analyses. And benefit cost analysis is sort of a logical approach to looking at land use and land and water management decisions. And it's not surprising that some early forms of that have been around for thousands of years really now. We see a lot of economic value in semi-arid regions, especially for agricultural land and irrigation. There's some really interesting literature and background and ideas on groundwater's role in regional economic development and the value of land. Ramon Llamas has some really wonderful papers on that, where he looks at the value of groundwater over time, where people initially settle a region that doesn't have much surface water. They will essentially tap and mine groundwater for a period of time to go from being very poor to being moderately well-off agriculturalists. That allows the society to gain some capital that they can use to then go out and develop surface water systems, which they can then use over time to supply the groundwater that they need to replenish in order to get through droughts. So it's a very elegant kind of an approach to looking at the evolution of societies and economies and land economics over time in some initially groundwater dependent regions that eventually become joint groundwater and surface water systems. And then of course we have tremendous amount of literature and experience on the importance of water quality and how that influences land values and land economics and land use decisions, in terms of safety, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of just utilitarian value of water that isn't polluted versus water that is polluted. The proximity of ecosystems is also something that we found to often have value to the land, and that proximity of the ecosystems is often very water dependent. So, oops. Some current issues we have in land and water economics. Certainly the management of droughts, at least certainly here in California and in the West, we're always very interested in droughts. Droughts tend to focus the mind, like disasters do, and help drive public policy improvements and changes in decisions. Groundwater overdraft is one of the bigger problems that we see come up during droughts. And it's also a chronic problem in water short areas. So when there's a shortage of surface water, what do people do? They go out back, they go drill a well, and they pump it because it takes decades often for the problems of groundwater overdraft to become evident. But we've been pumping some of these systems for over 100 years now. And so some of the groundwater overdraft problems are now becoming quite evident, and we have some big efforts in California and much of the world to address that issue. It's going to be expensive and difficult and controversial, of course. We have contamination problems. I mentioned water quality. Contamination problems of aquifers are often a little different from contamination problems of rivers. Rivers can become contaminated very quickly, and they can clean themselves up relatively quickly. Whereas aquifers, there's huge amounts of space in an aquifer. So it often takes much longer to dirty an aquifer. And consequently, it takes almost an infinite amount of time to clean up a large aquifer. For small gas stations and things like that, they're just a local plume. You can clean them up in a few years, but for nitrate contamination, which we have under most of our modern agriculture, and for salt contamination that we have in many arid and semi-arid regions, those are essentially permanent conditions once they happen. And you just have to deal with them as they are. Water allocations among users, again, in water short areas, everybody thinks that other people's water is waste and their water use is really needed. And that they have a right to that. So that often brings a lot of controversy. And then the other thing we have quite a lot of in much of the world, and certainly in the West, is high variabilities. Lots of floods, lots of droughts, and what do you do with a variable? On average, you're in great shape, but the average year is not what you want. The other thing that happens with the land and water management is it's highly decentralized. We have some decentralization in our land use decisions. We have quite a lot of decentralization often in water management that provides a lot of local responsiveness and some other good features, but it also kind of makes it noisy and high transaction costs in getting decisions made. It also involves quite a lot of different levels of government, which also bring both advantages and disadvantages. Where you have land and water together, it makes the water more valuable because you have land that you can use it on, and it makes the land more valuable because you have water that will expand the range of economic purposes and other purposes that you have for that land. And of course, higher quality brings higher value in terms of higher water quality, improving the range of things that you can do with the land and the value of that land for both economic and non-economic purposes. So this map to the right, cartoon to the right, just sort of shows how a lot of these things interact between the groundwater and the surface water and the rivers and the mountains and the prairies and the oceans and thus and such. So they're all very fun, complex systems that have a lot of externalities. The Western North America, I'll go through some examples here. The map to the right is all of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation projects in the 17 Western states. You can see they're all over the place. So early in the 1900s, the United States embarked on a huge amount of development of water systems in order to help populate the West and foster economic growth, particularly in an era where most of the economy was agricultural. We've seen some big changes in the economic structure of this region, where agriculture is now maybe 5% or less of the region's economy. And so the projects themselves are they're big regional projects, and they serve an economy which is much more diversified and much less agricultural than it used to be. So we have a lot of tensions from that. The aridity of Western North America provides a lot of challenges. We have long seasonal droughts. Basically, every year we have a 6 to 9 month drought. I'm originally from Delaware, and I like to tell people that every year California has a greater drought than most of the United States has ever seen in human history. Just because we have this very long dry season with the Mediterranean climate here in California in particular. We also have, when we do have droughts, they last often several years. So 4, 5, 6 years. We have times and places in the United States where we've had 12-year droughts. Because it's a driest region, we have accumulations of salts, particularly in aquifers, accumulation of nitrates and other things as well. We have competition for water and land, particularly where they're together, both for different water uses, different water users, and ecosystems as well. And then, of course, on the wet side of the semi-arid, we have floods as well. So California has flood problems that are as big as anybody's. Solutions, we've been living with this problem for more than 100 years or so. We have extensive infrastructure, the Bureau of Reclamation projects and other projects to store and move water, as well as extensive groundwater development. And over time, we've been trying to knit together the operation of these different kinds of infrastructure and systems, as well as managing the demands. So I think that's probably one of the most important realizations we've had in the last half century is we're never going to build our way out of our water problems. We also have to manage demands as well as supplies, which is pretty common in land use. You have to manage your demands as well as your supplies. We have local and extensive water markets, water transfer agreements, contracts, wastewater reuse, conjunctive use with groundwater, surface water, lots of different things, and they're very rich toolbox of solutions. We have some notable successes. California will always have water problems, but we've had relative success, certainly compared to historically, and also in terms of the relative damage that we get from droughts. It's relatively small compared to the overall economy. Colorado River and its cities and agriculture have, again, heavy investments in infrastructure. We have huge numbers. Something most people don't appreciate is the vital importance of the local infrastructure, the smaller local projects and the smaller regional projects. It's not just the big federal and state projects. The local projects are really probably the most important features of water management, really in any part of the world. And then, of course, with every success, you never have a pure, unmitigated success. Every success brings new problems. And we've seen that particularly, I think, for the environment, sustainability in these systems. In terms of conclusions, water, land, money, and values all interact. It's always a perpetual challenge that we have as societies and as individuals. Water usually enhances land values. Water regulation and management affects land economics. Interactions of land and water have supported and ended civilizations for millennia, going back to the ends of the Mesopotamian civilization from Salinization, and some of the challenges that we have in the West. The Western U.S. has a colorful history of examples, challenges, and solutions. If you want to see more about me, you can go to my website, and Steve Schwa is our next speaker on integrated watershed management.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Assuming you can see my screen. Yeah, looks like you can. So Holly did a pretty good job of talking about this first slide, so that's great. I don't have to spend much time on it. I will say that I spent a good deal of my professional career in the private sector with two partners that were of diverse water quality backgrounds. One was a water policy expert, the other was a hydrogeologist, which deals with groundwater and the aquifers, and he's probably one of the best in the state. And then my role was hydrology and engineering. So between the three of us, we had unique perspectives that we were able to bring together to kind of manage water more holistically, or integrated, as you will. So I was going to talk in the context of the water management experience in Florida. And Florida became a state in 1847, I believe, 48, sometime around then. And about 50 years later, got really into an obsession of overdraining the land, primarily for being able to have agriculture, to get on and about the land, drain the swamp. And agriculture then primarily needed irrigation, and groundwater is a large, cheap source for that. So overpumping and over drainage became kind of the norm. And with Florida, I guess the elephant in the room is the Everglades, and the obsession with drainage, or what was actually called in the 20th century at the time was called land reclamation. I'm not sure what it was being reclaimed for, but one of the most significant projects that took place was the draining and canal of straightening of the Kissimmee River from Orlando in the north to Lake Okeechobee at the south end, basically converting about 103 miles of meandering river and its floodplain to a straight shot 52-mile canal, running water efficiently off these ag lands with all the nutrients they carried to Lake Okeechobee. And as if that wasn't bad enough, historically, the Lake Okeechobee used to, in the wet season, in the summer, it would rise and just gradually sheet flow over a broad swath and into the Everglades and down into Florida Bay, creating an incredibly productive estuary at the south end of Florida. What happened was, in an effort that was largely incentivized by the federal government to try to adversely impact Cuba's economy, which was sugar back in the 50s and 60s, promoted growing sugar in South Florida, south of the lake, creating what's still referred to as the Everglades agricultural area, about 500 to 600,000 acres along the south side of Lake Okeechobee. Well, that also required a dike to be constructed along the south side of Lake Okeechobee to prevent water from flooding out the agriculture. Water could still get into the Everglades by canals, but nowhere near as efficiently and as much as it needed down in the Everglades and Florida Bay. Really started suffering from a lack of fresh water. To try to accommodate all this water that was building up in Lake Okeechobee, large canals were cut to drain Lake Okeechobee to the East Coast and West Coast, because they couldn't take it down to the Everglades anymore and through the agricultural area. And these canals are significant. This is what it kind of looks like today in an animation form. There is some water that can get down through canals and out and down through the Everglades, but a large amount of water is discharged and released to the east and west coasts of Florida from Lake Okeechobee, which is basically just collecting nutrients and pollutants. So that water is really there's a lot of it, and it's adding a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus to both coasts. And it's not a little water. This is what it looks like when they open those gates. And they may be open now with all the rain that we've had in the last few days, I would suspect. So that of course has led to some unintended but predictable consequences. The lack of fresh water in the Everglades and Florida Bay. They need more fresh water. All of the pollutants that are being discharged from Lake Okeechobee to the East Coast Indian River Lagoon has resulted in extreme algae outbreaks of blue-green algae, primarily to, I think, phosphorus. And on the West Coast, the discharges, and this is in some of the research that's come out in the past few years, and some of my had been fortunate to be involved in, is been able to link the nitrogen loads from Lake Okeechobee to how much long, to the duration of red tide blooms on the west coast of Florida, as well as probably severity and extent of it. And all of these problems are somewhat related to the management or mismanagement of Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades. Florida, however, has done some things right, I think, that can eventually get things resolved. And one of the first things was the Water Resources Act of 1972. It established that all water in Florida on the surface and in the ground is a public resource that's managed by the state of Florida, specifically the Department of Environmental Regulation. And a lot of that water management is delegated to 5 water management districts that were set up by the legislature. Now, the important thing about those water management districts is they are largely delineated around the major watersheds in Florida. South Florida, for example, is the Kissimmee River, Lake Okeechobee, and the Everglades. St. Johns River is mainly St. Johns River watershed. Southwest Florida is primarily Tampa Bay, Sarasota Bay, and the Charlotte Harbor National Estuaries. So it defines a unit that's defined not by political boundaries so much, but by watershed boundaries, which is helpful. The second thing is those districts are actually have a committed source of annual revenue that is a percentage of real estate values. So it's a committed and significant source of revenue, anywhere from around 70 million in the Northwest Florida to 1.2 billion in South Florida. With that revenue, the water management districts are responsible for several things. They're responsible for regulation, permitting of water use, as well as permits for land development, monitoring science. They collect an enormous amount of data, which is absolutely critical to being able to make decisions. But they also are able to invest in land acquisition and restoration, water quality, and infrastructure improvements. Lastly, the water management districts, by and large, look at 4 different areas of responsibility: natural systems, water quality, flood protection, and water supply. That's all kind of defined within the context of watershed management. That's the framework. And trying to integrate all that together is really part of the key. These are examples of different initiatives that the Southwest Florida Water Management District has an investment, anything from reuse of reclaimed water for irrigation to offset potable water demands, to regional water supply planning and development, water quality improvements, sea level rise, wetland assessments, minimum flows and levels for the environment, and agriculture investments as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. So with respect to water supply, this is an example of 4 counties that all banded together to form a regional water supply authority, where, and this was again heavily incentivized by the water management district, who really encourages for all of the utilities in a region to work together. And the carrot is really, if you do that, we will provide a conduit of revenue to that regional water supply authority, as long as you're all coordinating the water use together. And so in this region, these 4 counties, each county has a member that constitutes the board of the water supply authority. And they have together a portfolio of surface water reservoirs shown in dark blue, as well as well fields shown in dark green, that are all pretty much interconnected now. So they can move water pretty efficiently from one area to the next. And this came in pretty handy. I think it was in Charley, when Hurricane Charley, when Punta Gorda water supply went down. They were able to get water to them from the north. So this is a real success story, and it's basically a policy of the water management district to say, you know, if a utility in this region wants us to look at investing in a improvement, it has to come through the authority to make sure that everything's coordinated. And so it's been real successful over the past 20 years or so as a way of managing water supply. The other thing about water supply is that looking at the right water for the right use. I'd say over the past 20, 25 years, a lot of the area of Florida has moved towards not using potable water for irrigation. That's been done by the water management districts investing in and cooperating funding with utilities and whatnot for the reuse of treated reclaimed water, wastewater that's been treated, and using that as an irrigation source. The other thing that's been highly effective and promoted is a tiered water rate structure, which basically says the more water you use, the more you're going to pay for it. So the base rates are pretty cheap to basically on the premise that everyone is entitled to water for their basic needs, but no one's entitled to waste the water. These tiered rates have been proven to be very effective in reducing the amount of potable water that's being applied outdoors. And so between using non-potable water for irrigation and the tiered rates, very little potable water is used for irrigation in the region and in much of Florida. But the other thing that happened was, I think around the 1990s, 95 to 2000, was the federal government established energy efficiency standards, which a lot of people don't recognize also included water efficiency standards. And what happened was that led to building codes being amended back in the day, around 2000, to include these water efficiency standards for indoor water use fixtures. You've seen these as, I think they're called WaterSense or something. Well, EPA's, that's the new one, WaterSense, even more advanced. But in looking at water use accordingly, you can see in these three graphs, what they're showing is between 2003 and 2007, the population increased 40% from 550,000 to 750,000 in this region. However, the annual per capita water use, how much each person was using, dropped from 105 to 85 gallons per person per day. So it dropped about 19%. This is largely due to not using water for outdoor irrigation, potable water for irrigation, and these indoor appliance fixtures. Jay referred to demand management. That's part of what this is about. And as a result, between 2003 and 2017, the total water use used only increased 20%. So this had a big impact on reducing the amount of total water use. And so utilities that were looking at the population projections may have thought, oh, we need a new well field 10 years from now, or we need a new reservoir. And what they found out was, well, maybe they didn't. And they didn't need to make those investments. And this is not a phenomenon that's limited to any region of Florida in particular. It's statewide, and I think it even is applied across the country. We'd probably be in a lot more dire straits if these federal standards hadn't come out. And no one, I don't know if they really know about them. You feel like you're using the same amount of water when you flush your toilet or take a shower. But it's had a big role in reducing the amount of water that needs to be used. We could do even better. And it's a very efficient way cost-effective way, I think, to try to reduce and save water supply. And that extends into agriculture even. So the Water Management District, they require all agricultural operations that use, say, groundwater or any kind of water, really. If it's over 100,000 gallons per day, it has to be metered and it has to be reported. So they have records of all the groundwater being used within a region. They have an extensive monitoring program. They're gauging the aquifers, and they can determine if there's an issue, there's something happening. And they determined there was an issue in part of Southwest Florida called the Southern Water Use Caution Area. They studied it and determined that they needed to try to reduce the groundwater pumping. What was happening is a lot of the groundwater was upconing, bringing up chlorides and minerals, dissolved solids that are not good to put on crops. Of poorer water quality. And so they developed a recovery plan to reduce groundwater pumping from, I think, 50 to 60 million gallons a day. And one of the tools that they developed for this, and actually my two partners, when they were with the Water Management District, set this program up, was to cost share improvements with agriculture that would reduce their groundwater pumping. That would be memorialized in their permit. It would involve things like using surface water in a tailwater recovery pond, recycling their surface water, in other words, putting in water conservation features like water sensors and weather stations, And over the past 20 years now, the 240 farms projects have been involved, and it's reduced 20 million gallons per day. So about a half to a third of the overall target. And there's a lot of repeat customers. So very quickly if agriculture is going to be on board with something, because word of mouth between ag is probably quicker than anything. And if it's not successful, you know that too. So they'll reimburse 50% of the cost, and they'll reimburse up to 75% of the cost if there's also a water quality or natural system benefit associated with the project. And the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services also helps with the funding of that, with the Water Management District. Water quality, real quick, the state of Florida had what was called narrative nutrient criteria. And a lot of environmental groups sued the EPA saying that was not sufficient, that Florida needed to develop actually numbers for nutrients called numeric nutrient criteria. They won. EPA and the state battled it out for probably 5 years before the state finally came up with numeric nutrient criteria. It is set forth by region based upon the hydrogeology that's so diverse in Florida. So that makes sense. But one of the things that I've always noted is that the narrative criteria, while kind of broad-based and subjective, is actually really at the heart of the matter. And it survived. And it basically says, in no case shall nutrient concentrations of a body of water be altered so as to cause an imbalance in natural populations of aquatic flora and fauna. Basically, biology is what we're trying to make sure is not being affected. Nutrients are a surrogate for that, and too much nutrients can affect the biology. And the most recent legislation passed was for sea level rise resiliency. Chapter 38094 of the Florida statutes requires municipalities to do what's called the vulnerability assessment for critical assets. And that has to be based upon the NOAA projections for intermediate low and intermediate high sea level rise. And they have to look at planning horizons of 2040 and 2070. So, we refer to this a lot as sunny day flooding. It's on the increase. It's going to really kick up, I believe, in after 2030. But the state basically set this up and told municipalities, if you plan for infrastructure in the future based upon this criteria, we will help subsidize those investments. So it's an incentive for municipalities to do, and a lot of coastal communities, of course, are in the middle of doing this right now. It's going to be a big problem in a lot of the coastal areas in the future. So back to the Everglades. This is what I call now 21st century land reclamation, which is, a lot of people thought, well, the Everglades is so complex, it's been so mismanaged, we'll never get it back. But this is a big ray of hope. What has happened in recent years is the Water Management District has tactfully, with dynamite, removed a lot of the dams in the Kissimmee River. And then they filled in the canal. You can see this on Google Earth. The old river, the meanders, is still there. So they were careful to recreate those or not fill that part of it in. And so by the time they got done, you can see this is where the old canal was along this route, but it's gone. And the other thing they did was purchase this floodplain area from tree line to tree line to basically restore this entire ecosystem. This may be the most significant water restoration project in the world, and very few people know about it. In fact, very few people in Florida know about it, I think. But like I said, you can see it on Google Earth. It's really significant and been very effective. The wildlife comes back almost right away. It's very resilient to that. Just to add water is pretty much the key. But what about the Everglades? So this has been the big piece of the puzzle. I mentioned Big Sugar. I'm a big advocate for agriculture, but honestly, I cannot find a lot of positive things that the sugarcane production south of Lake Okeechobee has done. It's basically created this cesspool in Lake Okeechobee that gets discharged to the east and west coast, creating all kinds of algae problems there and not enough fresh water south. Two Rays of Hope in 2007. At the time, Governor Christ went to Big Sugar and said, let's talk about buying you out so that we can open back the flow through the area into the Everglades. And up to that point, you couldn't even mention that as a possible solution. It was just so off the table. Unfortunately, the subsequent governor did not support that, let the closing dates of the deal come and go. So only a fraction of what was going to be purchased was purchased. That's being converted into a reservoir. It's a start, but there's still a ways to go. The other thing that happened in 2014 that was encouraging is by about 75%, the voters of Florida approved an amendment to the Constitution that required a third of the documentary stamp revenue to be placed into land acquisition trust fund and spent on a variety of environmental programs and initiatives. This is slated to raise $22 billion by 2034. That certainly would seem sufficient to address the problem, along with all the revenue the water management districts have. So the thing is, there's really, really good science on the Everglades, because when in doubt, the politicians say, let's do a study. And sometimes when they get the study, their response is, let's do another study instead of actually doing something. But as a result, there is just off the chart science in my experience in the Everglades. There's money. And over time, hopefully, and we're getting close to that, there'll be political will. This is a cartoon, but it's a little bit misleading because all the other stakeholders are not really pulling together. They're pulling, in their own direction. But more and more, the east coast of Florida has gotten pretty organized, and they're pushing to cease the discharges to the east coast that's where all the manatee fatalities are occurring in Indian River Lagoon. It's really created a devastation over there that I don't know if they're ever going to get Indian River Lagoon back to the way it was. And the West Coast is starting to mobilize around it too. And then there's the Everglades Foundation and a lot of environmental organizations that are trying to get more water into Florida Bay. So I think it's inevitable. And it's just important that at the end of the day, science drive policy, not the other way around. And I think that at the end of the day, that's always what will happen. It just takes longer sometimes than others. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brass Bass, who's going to be speaking on invasive and non-native species economic impacts. Brad, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. I'm just getting my screen share going. That again. Okay, what I want to do is I want to use a water quality example based on invasive species and phosphorus pollution to show you how we went from engineering to economics in assessing how to make decisions around this issue. Before I start, I'd like to say I live in the city of Mississauga, Ontario, which is located on lands which are part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron, Wendat, and Wyandot nations. So where are we going? I want to start with an overview leading up to 2008. I want to talk about how I started as an engineer, went to become a scientist, and then eventually became an economist, and hopefully put it into a context that wraps up all the presentations. So the beginning. Lake Erie in 1970 was in pretty bad shape. Steve's slide on Lake Oaks, on the Big Sugar and the discharge to the east and west coast sort of reminds me of this. It was essentially a dumping ground for a lot of nutrients, especially phosphorus. And just to make sure you were oriented, that's where Lake Erie is. Below that would be the states of New York and Pennsylvania and Ohio. Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement was signed in 1972, and it was considered to be one of the most, the prime example of a bilateral agreement between two nations. But just to give you a sense of how bad things really were, Lake Erie got mentioned in the original publication of the Lorax by Dr. Seuss. It was later removed, but if you have the original edition of the Lorax, hold on to it because it's the only one that mentions Lake Erie, and it's probably will be worth something in the future. What did we do? We basically focused on wastewater treatment plants, this output of phosphorus from those treatment plants. We really cut them down. And in fact, we were so successful in the 1980s, recreational fishers were actually suggesting that we release more phosphorus back into the lake. It was too clean to support the populations of fish that they wanted to catch. You may remember that, in fact, we had, those who live in the area, you may remember the restrictions on phosphates in detergents that started to come up in 1970, 71. But something was happening. This is a map, really illustrates how much of the Lake Erie Basin is in agriculture. And something was happening with the agricultural heartland. One, there are a lot of population growth and land use changes that were changing the way land was managed. Two, changing climate. Three, there was an ecosystem change that was being brought about by aquatic invasive species, zebra and quagga mussels. And four, the phosphorus going into the lake was now much more bioavailable, so it could really drive the growth of species. What did the lake do? We got plumes of cyanobacteria, or what people call blue-green algae. We got blooms of Cladophora, which is an algae, and we got hypoxia in the central basin, which is a lack of oxygen and leads occasionally to fish kill. When I was first made aware of the return of phosphorus, I saw this as a technological issue. I was able to design technology. I could link that with other technologies, and the only complexity I was really concerned about was the complexity of the natural ecosystems within the technologies. So we had a prototype of a constructed flow vertical wetland. This, in fact, is not the prototype. It's the research model that was built in about 2014. Had a simulation model that we could use to test different ideas around the technology. We even had a winterized version of the technology, so we could put this wetland out in the field in the summer, but leave it there all year long. It would not be damaged by the winter weather. We even found an economic use for zebra mussels, which are really the bedrock in terms of the home for the Cladophora algae. We could harvest them and use them as part of the green roof growing media. So everything seemed pretty hunky-dory. It turns out there were also a lot of other best management practices, and this was a bit of a shock. We decided to look at all of them to see how effective they were and which is really the best ones to recommend. And we found out that the uncertainties in the reduction of phosphorus were so large that, in fact, the benefits were often negative. And when I looked at wetland restoration, and essentially my technology was a wetland just in the vertical, I found that the uncertainties were large enough that at times they would cause phosphorus loads to increase. And that was the same with virtually all of the best management practices. In some locations, under some climates, under some conditions, they would actually lead to increasing phosphorus loads, not decreasing phosphorus loads. Why are the uncertainties so large? Well, my thinking changed again, and I went from just looking at the technology to realizing we needed a better scientific understanding of the issue. We needed to have a better understanding of how things linked up at different spatial scales and the linkages between climate and management on the land. What we found out was it's complicated. When you're dealing just with a farm, you're looking at 4 processes across 14 different locations that you have to be concerned about as you reduce the phosphorus you're using, as you try to contain the phosphorus on the soil, and what you can't reduce and contain, you try to trap before it leaves the soil. When you go to the response of the lake, it's even more complex. And this is actually a simplification of the complexity that you would find in an aquatic ecosystem. The original diagram of this model was so complex. There's so many lines, it was affectionately named the hairball, because that's what it looked like. So basically, we got to Aristotle's situation. The more we knew we didn't know. Or that famous quote, there are no knowns, known unknowns, and we were now facing the unknown unknowns. So my evolution of my thinking switched again. And in 2015, I started to really dig into the impact of social and economic factors on the adoption of new management practices. So the question I asked was, when this happens in the lake, when we get the dead zones, when we get the plumes, when we get the fish kills, how much does it cost? What I realized is, first question I had to answer was, do we want to take an economics perspective or an accounting perspective? And just to give some humor about what an economist is versus an accountant, the economists are accountants with personality, or the economists are always get it wrong. But in fact, there really is a serious difference between the two disciplines. And for us, the real difference was the impact of algal blooms on social welfare. And that became the driving question for me, and which is why we took an economics approach to the issue as opposed to accounting approach to the issue. Both approaches, by the way, would be valid, but they would lead to different answers and different solutions. And we felt for policy, the economic approach was a better approach. We actually did 4 analyses. We looked at the direct cost to the economy. We looked at the secondary costs of algal blooms. We looked at the cost-benefit analysis of different best management practices, and we looked at the stimulus effect of widespread adoption of best management practices. I'm going to focus on the findings from the direct costs to the economy, because that study was the foundation of every other study that we did. Now, just to show you what we're doing and not doing here, direct costs look at the social costs imposed upon people who use Lake Erie's ecosystem, goods, and services. And I'll show you which ones we landed on in 2 slides. The secondary costs are what many people often think about when they think about this analysis, because that's where we get into things that you might recognize, which are things like GDP, employment, and wages. But basically, that's where we get into the costs, the impact of those who do business with the people who are primarily affected by the direct costs, and also the reductions in spending. So how do we assess the value? We started by doing an analysis of the ecosystem services that were important for our purposes. And we were reviewing ecological values, social cultural values, intrinsic values. But what we really focused on was, what are the impacts on people's satisfaction or their welfare? In more detail, what we decided to do was link the changes in water quality values to something called the water quality ladder. And that allowed us to, as you'll see, to place the values in terms people understood. And then from there, we could then look at, well, how much are people willing to pay to reach different rungs on the ladder? So the whole process started with phosphorus control scenarios, intensity projections of algal blooms, the link to the water quality ladder, the costs that were triggered, and then the net present value of the annual costs. So the cost categories we looked at were commercial fishing, which was a reduced value added, the water uses, which was a capital spending and operating cost analysis, the recreational users, which was reduced utility, the non-users. Essentially, these are people who live close to but are not on the lake and are concerned with the lake but don't directly use the lake. Again, it was a utility question, the tourism industry, again, reduced value added, and property owners, reduction in wealth. Notice we didn't look at health issues, and that's because when we looked through all the data, the health sector in Ontario is just so big that this really was literally a drop in the lake or a drop in the ocean and didn't have an impact. So for the control scenarios, we looked at 3 scenarios. The stable lake, in other words, keeping the lake exactly where it is, business as usual, allowing phosphorus to increase without control, and a policy intervention, acting to meet our load reduction targets. So what we ended up doing was, of course, relating algal blooms to water quality, monetize that using the willingness to pay and the direct cost to users. What is the water quality ladder? As I said, it's a ladder. It's a ranking of water quality from 0 to 10, but really that's translated to things that people relate to. Is it boatable? Is it fishable? Is it swimmable? Can you drink it? Now, once we understand how the water quality ladder, the question is, how do we get to the cost? And one thing I did leave out because of the complexity, we actually created our own probability model of algal blooms under those 3 scenarios and ran each scenario 10,000 times, which gave us the probabilities of very severe outbreaks of algae, which we then able to use to map onto the water quality ladder. To get to the cost of it all, we went from the water quality ladder to the willingness to pay. And this was basically based on an analysis of about 50 other studies that allowed us to come up with numbers that we could use for people's willingness to pay to move the water quality from non-boatable to boatable, from boatable to fishable, from fishable to swimmable, and up to drinkable. Notice we had average values, minimum values, and maximum values as well. So without going through more of the numbers, what we found was that in the business as usual scenario, the central estimate for the cost over 30 years was $5.3 billion. And notice there was an upper bound and a lower bound. And notice that the costs for the stable lake were about half of what they were for the business as usual, and the cost for the policy intervention was even lower at about $2.5 billion over 30 years. On an annual basis, that would come out to $272 million for the business as usual. And again, the policy intervention case was much lower, as was the stable lake scenario. I do want to show you some of the results from the public benefits of the best management practices. Looks like we're missing. What I want to draw your attention to is the total annual benefit, which is $350 million a year, but also where that comes from. And it turns out the largest public benefit of these management practices is the potential for carbon sequestration. And the second largest, and I know some of you will really appreciate this, is the improvement in biodiversity by using these best management practices. And again, the total public benefit was $350 million. What we found was, which I thought was very interesting, is when we compared the benefits to the costs, they were very close to each other. In other words, we hit a situation where we kind of knew where the benefits would equal or just exceed the costs. So our public benefit from best management practices was $350 million a year, and the direct cost of the algal blooms was 272 million a year. It was actually 272 point something, and that's why that says 273. The total benefit of the best management practices were 400 million, and although I didn't go through the analysis, the total direct plus secondary costs were 412 million, essentially equal. The 30-year benefit of those best management practices was 8 billion, and the direct cost of not doing anything was 5.3 billion. They're not equal, but they're in the same order of magnitude. They're in the same ballpark. So basically, we're at a situation where the benefits of acting more or less cover the costs of not acting. Now, those economic impacts for the economy of Ontario are actually small. I mean, they're not large. They're not going to shake the economy, but they're still significant. The 272 million is actually equivalent to the budget of a large city like Toronto, or at least it was in 2015. The 412 million represents a loss in spending in the basin economy. It's the same order of magnitude as a new bridge, such as the Gordie Howe Bridge linking Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, which is 570 million, or the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which is just completed and open, linking the oil fields in Alberta to shipping port and coast of British Columbia at 730 million. So although these costs would not shake the economy, they are significant, and they're similar to other costs that we might absorb in the public sector. Now, to put this into a larger context, I took a look at the ecological footprint literature, and I actually just received this. The timing was perfect. It came about a week before I did the presentation. Earth Overshoot Day marks the date in which our demand for resources in a given year exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in that year. It's been getting earlier. This year we'll hit Earth Overshoot Day on August 1st. Whereas back in 1970, it was much later in December when we would hit Earth Overshoot Day. The other interesting context to think about is if the population of the world lived at the same standard of living as Americans experience, we would need 5 planets every year to support the resource demand of that population. You'll notice as you move down the chart, you eventually hit less than 2 planets a year and almost 1 planet a year. So you can sort of see how far above a sustainable limit we would be if we brought everybody up to the same standard of living. And it echoes a comment I heard many years ago from an ecologist where he said, you know, the problem is in the world, he didn't see it as a problem being of poverty. He saw the problem as being one of wealth in terms of thinking about our ecological impact. So thank you for your attention, and please feel free to reach out and contact me if you have any further questions.
Okay. Can we move to the Q&A now? All right, well, we have a few minutes for questions, and there's been a few submitted. And if anyone who's on the line now would like to ask questions, you can put them into the chat. We will try to address them. One of the questions has been put is for any of the panelists, and this looks like it might be more in Jay's bailiwick, but what are the top 2 or 3 pricing initiatives that could rationalize or optimize the use of water in the Western US? A simple question.
Mm.
Yeah, no answer will be universally popular. I think pricing is important. Is some tendency by economists, by some economists, to view pricing as the only solution to any problem. I don't think that's entirely true. I'm kind of a fan of having some limited amount of water markets activity. Markets are pretty good about giving price signals to everybody for a lot of purposes. So in the analysis we've done, we see that if you have maybe as little as 5% of the water available on as a sort of movable by markets, that takes care of almost all of the economic problems that can be solved easily. And it also gives you the price signals, value signals for helping making public investment decisions. I think there's a big difference, I think, between pricing you want to do for the different sectors. Agriculture is by far the biggest human water user, at least in the West. Those crops it's important that water be priced. It's important that water be priced so as to show the opportunity costs, at least in the other economic sectors. And I think that will be sufficient. I think the true opportunity cost of that water use is often higher than the economic opportunity costs. But if you get it up to the economic opportunity costs, I think you're doing pretty well.
Okay, thank you. There's a question for Brad. You mentioned how much value is associated with the carbon sequestration aspect of the programs that you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit more about how carbon sequestration works in that case, and how it is it creates the kind of value that you described?
Yeah, so when that analysis was done, first of all, we were surprised by that. So because of course, we really expected the biggest benefit to be directly in the reduction of phosphorus. We assumed that, we took the current price of carbon, global price of carbon. We assumed, we based on what we were reading, how much it would increase over the next 30 years. And what we realized is that, many of the best management practices, in fact, increase vegetation. It's not that they necessarily decrease energy use, but they do increase the ability of the soil to sequester carbon, most likely in the surface vegetation. That was not even something we had thought about when we had started the exercise. It was brought to our attention that we should look at it. But one reason the benefit was so large is because there currently is a price of carbon. So it's also based on the fact that, in some sense, you could, by sequestering carbon, either sell carbon credits or be paid for the carbon you were sequestering.
How does the sequestration work in the context of the water itself?
So it's not the water, it's what you're doing on the soil. All those best management practices are in the soil themselves. So you can directly affect it. If you put up a tree line or windbreak, you're going to end up planting a lot of trees. If you put in a cover crop, you're going to increase the amount of vegetation cover on your soil. You're going to, I don't know if you'll double it, but you could double it, or at least increase it by a third every year. If you restore a wetland, again, the vegetation in that wetland, once is going to sequester more carbon than you otherwise would. If you were to even uh, restore fragile land with trees. That would actually sequester a tremendous amount of carbon if you were to create woodlots on land that really wasn't suitable for farming anymore. So it's the actions you do to protect the water on the land that lead to the carbon sequestration benefit.
This is a related question, is that in your cost benefit analysis, you're putting the value or a cost number on inaction versus the cost of action.
Right.
And how do you translate the costs that are done on a kind of the inaction to actual financing that gets applied to these solutions?
That's a question that I was about to really start to look at before I left that part of the government and left that role. What really interested me was so the government of Canada had actually experimented with with using bonds to finance greenhouse gas reduction activities. You could actually buy a bond, it would be used to invest in those activities, and the bond was redeemable like any other bond you would buy. And I thought, well, now that we know what the cost of inaction is, we have the basis to create ecological bonds or eco bonds for water quality in the Great Lakes. And that was a proposal I had started to lay out within the context of the work I did. And then I got this other job offer, so I had to leave that work, and I don't think anybody picked up on it.
Steve, it's a question for you. You outlined a really interesting story about what's happening in Florida. If you could see one policy implemented at the federal level, what would it be? And in the same manner, at the state level, what would you see as being policy actions that can be taken at those two levels to address the issues that you're discussing?
Well, yeah. So at the state level, my pet peeve would be to reinitiate discussions to terminate sugar in the Everglades, and that it's tricky because you would need to work with those communities down there that are relying on that for their economy. But frankly, the destruction's been done to the water and air quality. They do pre-harvest burns those communities are sacrifice zones for that. So there's, I think, lots of opportunity to work with those communities to create a more resilient economy that's based upon the value of the world's only Everglades as an attraction. As far as the federal government goes, I would say, and this kind of relates to the thing Brad was saying on soils. Not only is agriculture the biggest user of water, but they're also the biggest user of chemicals for fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, all the sides. And the federal government started doing that. I think there's something called the Organic Transition Initiative, which is subsidizing farmers in that 3-year period, moving from conventional chemical agriculture to biology and soil building. We looked at something like that in Florida, and a lot of the citrus industry is starting to look at that too, because they don't have any biology left in their soil, applying all these chemicals, and now they're being devastated by diseases and viruses that have put the citrus industry back to like 1963 production levels. So incentivizing getting agriculture, and the European Union is doing this really effectively, but we only have 1% of our farms that I think are organic. We really need to be moving into better soil building with the microbial community doing the work instead of applying chemicals. That would dramatically reduce the biggest source of nitrogen, phosphorus from these water bodies, I think. And also, as Holly testified, I see this in other lots like hers, where they've revegetated and built soils. You get rain and you don't have any runoff. It soaks it all. Organic soil can hold an enormous amount of water, which means it's more resilient in a flood and a drought. So that's what I would do if I could.
You said that would be a state legislation?
Federal. Federal, at the federal level. I mean, the Mississippi Basin, Lake Erie, I mean, it's a lot of phosphorus runoff, like I think Brad was saying, but I've talked to people up there, and, you know, I worked with the University of Florida down here on a patent for something called biochar that we developed for absorbing phosphorus. And it's a great soil amendment, but it also can absorb the phosphorus that's mobile in the upper horizons of the soil. And so phosphorus and nitrogen, I mean, those nutrients are incredibly important. We all need them, but too much is a real problem. That's what's causing all these algae blooms and whatnot everywhere, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So by building up soils, what happens is the microbes in there are able to process the nutrients and release them in a bioavailable form. So you don't need as much or maybe no fertilizer, chemical fertilizer. And that's what the organic guys know. That's how they farm. They build soil. They don't grow crops. That's their bank.
Actually, the tree strategy I started to outline, creating woodlots on marginal land, was also linked with the biochar strategy as well. Because we hadn't talked about that, I didn't want to go into it. But the state of Vermont used to give out an award for innovative phosphorus reduction. In 2019, that award went to someone who developed the biochar filter.
Okay.
Yeah, we've done that with just regular wood material too. When it's submerged and was anaerobic, it'll track the bacteria that puts nitrate back in the atmosphere. And that's really cost effective. Even more, biochar is kind of expensive way to go, but for removing phosphorus, but the woody material we found, even sawdust, is really pretty effective.
Just going back to the agricultural question on sugar, which seems to be a big element in Florida's water issues. But you probably know that sugar cane agriculture has pretty much been phased out of Hawaii. And I'm wondering if there's any lessons there to be learned about how to transition that industry in Florida, or if they're just such completely different markets that they're not comparable.
I'm sorry, I didn't follow.
Yeah, I'm just talking about a lot of what you described that's happening in Florida has to do with the sugar industry. And in Hawaii, you may not know this, being from the East Coast, but there was a huge sugar industry there, which is no longer there. It's basically gone to Asia and other places. But wondering if there's any lessons to be learned for Florida in terms of how to transition away from that type of agriculture, specifically around sugar.
Yeah, the issue is not so much sugar or agriculture, it's where it's located. It's the placement of putting it right where the Lake Okeechobee pulsed every year like a heart in putting water in the Everglades. And so blocking and putting a dike there and then dumping and then creating a cesspool in the Lake Okeechobee and then just releasing that water to both coasts that wreaks havoc with these algae. It's been linked directly. That's what's causing a lot of the severe algae duration being longer and more severe and whatnot. So it's really where it's located is the biggest issue.
So there's the ability to accommodate the sugar industry in Florida, but not in the distribution and geographical locations that it's currently.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, the state did. There were a lot of dairy farms, for example, right north of Lake Okeechobee that are a high source of phosphorus, and phosphorus is the big issue over there. And the state relocated them, bought them out and relocated them, got them out of being in so close proximity. So a lot of it's about location.
A lot of dollars involved as well. I think we have time for one more question, or at least one more. And Jay, a question to you. This is a big question. Is how is sea level rise likely to affect coastal land values and restoration and recreation activities?
We have a saying in ecosystems, for aquatic ecosystems, at least in estuaries, that elevation is destiny. And I think that's that's gonna be true. We're gonna have some of the coasts, the urban coasts will probably harden. Sort of like the Dutch have done over 1,000 years or so. We're gonna have some areas that are too expensive to harden, and we will have to let them go. Even the Dutch are doing that with some lands there. And that'll be a particular problem for our barrier islands and a lot of our coastal areas that are subject to hurricanes, which includes probably almost all of Florida. Sea level rise is gonna be a big challenge, even for the big cities that have ample resources and are very well organized and have access to tremendous expertise. It's still gonna be fairly expensive for them to raise their drainage systems and their wastewater discharge systems, and then to protect their land from flooding.
And Steve, the last question to you on this very topic, if you have any observations or information about how Florida is addressing that, since it is such a low-lying area that will be impacted by this sea level rise.
Yeah, our governor said we can't talk about climate change or use that phrase, but the legislature they use sea level rise resiliency, I guess, is code for climate change. And the legislature is actively incentivizing coastal communities to start looking at those projections of sea level rise published by NOAA periodically, and then planning their infrastructure accordingly. And they'll provide revenue to help build that infrastructure if it's built in consideration of sea level rise. That said, a lot of the coastal communities, from what I've seen, if sea level rise gets to, and what we have is what we call sunny day flooding. So when there's a king high tide, certain times of the year, streets will flood on a sunny day. The tide just comes up and backs up and comes back up in the streets. That's what's going to get worse and worse. And it's going to be more days. And from what I've seen, based upon the orientation of the moon to the earth, and after 2030, 2030, it's going to accelerate. So we have some time to plan for it now. But frankly, when that gets above 4, if that gets above elevation 4 or mean sea level, it's going to be really, really difficult for a lot of barrier islands to address it, because that gets to a point where it's really hard to manage. You can only elevate roads so much. Most of the residents, fortunately, should be elevated for a hurricane, so they could be fortified in a way above it. It's just you can't get in and out, and the infrastructure, the communications, the electricity, the power units, the lift stations, the water and sewer line. That's what's being planned for now, is how do you address all that infrastructure for sea level rise. It's a huge challenge, and it could have a huge impact on real estate values, as if we need something else.
Yeah, we're seeing that even in San Francisco, where all of the northern waterfront, the plans require the elevation of the seawall lot and the finger piers by up to 4 feet, which is billions and billions of dollars. So that's a problem that we're all going to be facing in the future. Okay, well, I think we're out of time, and I just want to thank all of you for your excellent, really insightful and interesting presentations. And I hope everyone who's online here who sees this later in its recorded version enjoys this. And we look forward to more of these kinds of informative get-togethers in the future. So thank you all very much. Paula, you have any last words of wisdom?
Yes, sorry, I don't have my video. Just know that our fall, we're going to be doing 2 semi-annual webinars, and it's been approved that the fall one will be an introduction to the cost of commercial agriculture and soil health. So a lot of the things that especially Steve was talking about, will be addressed in a more thorough manner, and it'll give another platform for us to kick off for other more specific webinars. Thank you, everybody, for joining and your support. What we're doing is important here.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you all.